Amara's small lemonade stand, a symbol of her innocence, became the center of humiliation she could never have imagined. As the police car pulled up, lights flashing, officers demanded she pack up her things, treating her as though she'd committed a crime simply for selling lemonade. The sharp whispers of neighbors and the condescending smirk of the woman who called them cut deeper than any words, leaving Amara standing there, tears in her eyes, questioning why something so pure could invite such cruelty. It was one of those golden summer mornings that smelled of fresh-cut grass and lemonade. The kind of day that made you want to believe in the simple joys of life. 8-year-old Amara was out early, her mother's old wooden table set up at the edge of their yard, under the shade of an ancient oak tree. On it rested a big glass jar of homemade lemonade, its vibrant yellow glowing like sunshine. Amara had decorated the table herself, carefully arranging hand-painted signs that read, "Lemonade, 50 cents, homemade with love." She even added little paper flowers in mason jars for a touch of charm. Her mother, Yvonne, watched from the porch, sipping her coffee and smiling as Amara hustled with childlike enthusiasm. Each passerby was met with a wide, gap-toothed grin and an excited wave. It wasn't just about the money for Amara. She was raising funds for her school's summer reading program, and every cup sold felt like a victory. But the idyllic moment cracked like glass when Mrs. Grayson, the neighbor from across the street, appeared at her window. The blinds parted just enough to reveal her sharp, prying eyes. Everyone on the block knew Mrs. Grayson. Her yard was always perfectly manicured, her white hydrangeas blooming in precise rows, and her disdain for any nonsense was legendary. Amara, unaware of the scrutiny, continued happily selling her lemonade. A group of kids on bikes stopped by, laughing and chattering as they handed over their coins. Yvonne clapped from the porch. But inside her house, Mrs. Grayson seethed. She had been waging a silent war against the noise and chaos of the neighborhood for years, and in her eyes, this little lemonade stand was just another example of people forgetting the rules. Not long after, the sound of a door slamming echoed across the street. Mrs. Grayson emerged, her hair pinned back tight and her lips pursed into a thin line of disapproval. She marched across her perfectly trimmed lawn, her shoes clicking like the ticking of a bomb. "Excuse me," she barked, her voice cutting through the warm summer air. Amara looked up, startled, clutching a plastic cup mid-pour. "Yes, ma'am," she said, polite but wary. Mrs. Grayson planted herself in front of the stand, her arms crossed. "Do you have a permit for this?" Amara blinked, confused. "A permit for this business," Mrs. Grayson said, gesturing at the table as if it were some unsightly garbage. "Selling food or drinks requires a permit in this county. Did your mother not teach you that?" Yvonne, who had been watching the exchange, stood up and walked over. Her smile was gone now, replaced by a quiet, simmering anger. "She's a child," Yvonne said, her voice measured but firm. "She's selling lemonade in her own yard. Surely, that doesn't require a permit." Mrs. Grayson tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. "The law is the law," she said, "and some of us actually respect it." Amara, sensing the tension, tugged at her mother's hand. "Mama, it's okay," she whispered, but Yvonne wasn't having it. "You don't have to do this," Yvonne said to Mrs. Grayson, her voice low but steady. "She's not hurting anyone. She's just trying to do something good." But Mrs. Grayson had already pulled out her phone. "If you won't take it down, I'll let the authorities handle it," she said, dialing 911. Amara's eyes widened, tears threatening to spill over. Yvonne knelt down beside her, pulling her into a protective hug. "It's okay, baby," she murmured. "You didn't do anything wrong." Within minutes, a police car rolled down the street, its flashing lights absurdly out of place in the quiet suburban neighborhood. Amara watched frozen as the officer stepped out, his expression somewhere between confused and apologetic. "Ma'am," he said to Mrs. Grayson, "we got a call about an unlicensed lemonade stand?" Mrs. Grayson nodded emphatically, pointing at the table like it was evidence in a crime scene. "It's against county regulations. I thought it best to report it." The officer sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He walked over to Amara, crouching down to meet her eyes. "Hey there," he said gently. "Is this your stand?" Amara nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, sir." He smiled softly. "You know, this lemonade looks pretty good. Can I have a cup?" Amara blinked, surprised. Sure," she said, pouring him a cup with trembling hands. The officer took a sip, exaggerating a satisfied, before turning back to Mrs. Grayson. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I think we can let this one slide. She's just a kid, and this is harmless." Mrs. Grayson bristled, her face turning a deep shade of red. "Harmless? Rules exist for a reason." The officer stood up, his tone firming. "And discretion exists for a reason too. Let the kid sell her lemonade." As the officer walked back to his car, Mrs. Grayson stormed back into her house, slamming the door so hard that her hydrangeas quivered. But the story didn't end there. Word of the incident spread quickly, thanks to a neighbor who had filmed the entire thing. By evening, the video was all over social media. People were outraged, not at Amara, but at Mrs. Grayson. Comments flooded in, calling her out for her pettiness and thinly veiled racism. The next day, something remarkable happened. Cars began lining up in front of Amara's house. Neighbors, friends, even strangers from other parts of town showed up to buy lemonade. Amara's little stand became a symbol of defiance and community. By the end of the week, she had raised over $1,000 for her reading program. And Mrs. Grayson, her perfect little world, began to crumble. The backlash online was relentless, and neighbors who once tolerated her began keeping their distance. The very rules she clung to so rigidly now felt like a cage, isolating her in her own home. As for Amara, she learned something important that summer. She learned that kindness and courage could outshine even the darkest moments. And every time she saw another car pull up to her stand, she couldn't help but smile, knowing she had turned lemons into so much more than lemonade. Over the next few days, the neighborhood seemed to pulse with a newfound energy. Cars continued to pull up in front of Amara's house, some of them strangers from neighboring towns who had seen the viral video and wanted to show their support. People brought their kids to buy lemonade, handed Amara far more than 50 cents, and lingered on the sidewalk to chat with Yvonne. The lemonade stand was no longer just about lemonade. It was about making a statement. Kindness and innocence would not be bullied, especially not by the likes of Mrs. Grayson. One sunny afternoon, Amara was busy at her stand, counting out the bills and coins with an infectious grin. A group of teenagers from the local high school had just stopped by to donate $20 without even taking a cup. "You're awesome," one of them said, fist-bumping Amara before riding off on her skateboard. Yvonne leaned against the porch railing, watching her daughter with pride. But she also noticed something else. Mrs. Grayson's blinds were drawn tight, her house unusually silent. For the first time in years, no one saw Mrs. Grayson trimming her hedges or reprimanding kids for stepping too close to her lawn. The neighborhood had grown quieter in her absence, but not in a peaceful way. There was an undercurrent of unease. Some felt sorry for her, but most chalked it up to karma finally catching up. Yvonne, however, couldn't quite shake the feeling that this silence wasn't just her retreating from embarrassment. It was something deeper. Later that evening, after the rush of lemonade customers had died down, Yvonne sat on the porch while Amara worked on painting more signs for the stand. A knock interrupted the calm. Standing at the door was Mr. Taylor, the retired postal worker who lived a few houses down. "Evening, Yvonne," he said, tipping his cap. "Can I have a word?" "Of course," Yvonne said, stepping onto the porch. Mr. Taylor glanced toward Mrs. Grayson's house, lowering his voice. "I don't mean to stir the pot, but has anyone checked on her?" Yvonne raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Grayson, why would anyone check in on her after the scene she caused?" "Well," Mr. Taylor began, shifting uneasily, "I've lived on this street for 20 years. Say what you want about her, but I've never seen her keep quiet like this. She hasn't picked up her mail in days, and when I walked by earlier, I swear I heard her crying through the window." Yvonne frowned. "Crying?" Mrs. Grayson, The woman who seemed incapable of anything softer than a sneer? The thought unsettled her. Maybe it's guilt, Yvonne said finally. She's probably just embarrassed. She brought this on herself. Mr. Taylor hesitated, then nodded. You might be right, but something about it doesn't sit right with me. Yvonne couldn't stop thinking about it after Mr. Taylor left. As much as she disliked Mrs. Grayson, the idea of her sitting alone in that house, crying, gnawed at her. Despite everything, Yvonne believed in. The next morning, Yvonne decided to bake a batch of blueberry muffins. Amara watched curiously as her mother placed them in a basket. Are those for me? Amara asked, hopeful. No, baby, Yvonne said. They're for Mrs. Grayson. Amara's face fell. Why? She was so mean to me. Yvonne knelt down to meet her daughter's eyes. Sometimes when people act mean, it's because they're hurting inside. We don't have to like what she did, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be kind. Amara pouted but nodded, her small fingers tracing the edge of the basket. Can I come with you? Yvonne smiled. Of course. Together, they walked across the street to Mrs. Grayson's house. The lawn was still immaculate, but the curtains remained drawn, giving the house an eerie, lifeless quality. Yvonne hesitated before knocking. It took several long moments before they heard footsteps on the other side. When the door finally opened, Mrs. Grayson stood there, looking like a shadow of herself. Her hair was unkempt, her eyes red and swollen. She didn't say anything, just stared at Yvonne and Amara, her expression unreadable. We brought you some muffins, Yvonne said gently, holding out the basket. Mrs. Grayson blinked, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. She looked at Amara, her gaze softening slightly, then back at Yvonne. Finally, she stepped aside, gesturing for them to come in. The inside of the house was spotless, almost sterile, but the air felt heavy. Yvonne set the basket on the kitchen counter and turned to Mrs. Grayson, who was fidgeting with the hem of her cardigan. Are you okay? Yvonne asked carefully. Mrs. Grayson sank into a chair, covering her face with her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to ruin her lemonade stand. Amara tilted her head. Then, why did you call the police? Mrs. Grayson looked up, her eyes filling with tears. Because I was angry. Angry at everything. My husband passed away last year, and this house, it's so quiet now. Every day, I wake up, and it's like the walls are closing in on me. I guess I thought if I could control the little things, like the noise or the kids running around, maybe I wouldn't feel so powerless. Yvonne's heart softened as she listened. It didn't excuse Mrs. Grayson's behavior, but it explained it. I didn't know, Yvonne said gently. Mrs. Grayson shook her head. You couldn't have. I've always been difficult. That's what my husband used to say. Her voice broke on the last word. Amara, who had been quiet up until now, walked over and placed a small hand on Mrs. Grayson's knee. I'm sorry about your husband, she said softly. Mrs. Grayson looked at Amara, stunned. Then, for the first time, she smiled, a small, tentative smile, but a smile nonetheless. That moment marked the beginning of something unexpected. Mrs. Grayson didn't become the warm, friendly neighbor overnight, but she started coming out of her house more. She even stopped by the lemonade stand one afternoon and bought a cup, though she grumbled about the price being too low. As for Amara, her stand continued to thrive, raising enough money not just for the reading program, but also to buy new books for the local library. She became something of a local celebrity, her story featured in a small segment on the evening news. And though the neighborhood still remembered Mrs. Grayson's initial outburst, they began to see her in a new light. Slowly but surely, bridges were built. In the end, the summer wasn't just about lemonade or viral videos. It was about learning that even the hardest hearts could be softened with a little kindness, and that sometimes the sweetest victories come not from winning a battle, but from choosing to forgive. As the summer heat grew heavier, so did the weight of evolving situation with Mrs. Grayson and the neighborhood. Yvonne found herself in an unexpected position, navigating a newfound connection with the woman who had caused so much trouble. Yet, even as the days passed with small moments of growth, a simmering tension began to brew beneath the surface. Amara's lemonade stand remained a beacon of hope and joy for the community, drawing in people from all over the town. But as the crowds grew larger, so did the whispers, subtle murmurs that hinted at something darker. One evening, as Yvonne was tidying up the stand with Amara, a man approached, his face vaguely familiar. He was in his late 40s, with graying hair and a nervous energy that made Yvonne uneasy. "Excuse me," the man said, his eyes darting around as if he were afraid someone might overhear. "You're Yvonne, right? Amara's mother?" "Yes," Yvonne replied cautiously. "Can I help you?" The man hesitated before pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "I think you should read this. It's about Mrs. Grayson." Yvonne unfolded the paper, her brow furrowing as she scanned the typed words. It was an anonymous letter detailing a shocking accusation. Mrs. Grayson had been involved in a legal battle years ago after she had falsely accused a black family of theft, resulting in the father's wrongful imprisonment. The letter claimed that the family had eventually won a settlement, but the damage had already been done. "I don't understand," Yvonne said, her voice trembling. "Why are you telling me this?" The man looked down, his guilt evident. "I used to work for the courthouse. I recognized her from the case. When I saw the video of your daughter and the lemonade stand, I knew I had to come forward. People like her, they don't change." Yvonne's stomach churned. Could it be true? Was Mrs. Grayson's behavior toward Amara part of a larger pattern of prejudice? That night, Yvonne sat on her porch, the letter clutched in her hand. She debated what to do. Should she confront Mrs. Grayson? Share the information with the neighborhood? Or was it possible that the letter was a fabrication meant to stir up trouble? Meanwhile, inside her house, Mrs. Grayson sat by the window, staring at the lemonade stand across the street. She had noticed the man who'd approached Yvonne earlier and recognized him immediately. A surge of dread washed over her. The past she had worked so hard to bury was resurfacing, threatening to destroy the fragile progress she had made. Over the next few days, Yvonne kept her distance from Mrs. Grayson, unable to shake the doubts planted by the letter. But the neighborhood was abuzz with activity. Rumors began to spread, half-truths and assumptions that spiraled out of control. One afternoon, as Amara served lemonade to a line of eager customers, a middle-aged woman approached the stand. She was one of Mrs. Grayson's few remaining friends, and her tone was sharp. "Is your mother teaching you to stir up trouble?" The woman sneered. Amara's eyes widened, and she shrank back. "What? You people are so quick to cry foul," the woman continued. "Do you even know how much Mrs. Grayson has been through? She's not the villain you're making her out to be." Before Amara could respond, Yvonne appeared, her voice like steel. "That's enough," she said. "If you have something to say, you can say it to me." The woman glared at Yvonne. "You think you're so righteous, don't you? But maybe you should ask yourself why everyone's so quick to judge Mrs. Grayson. You don't know her story." Yvonne's fists clenched at her sides. "And you don't know mine. Now, unless you're here to buy lemonade, I suggest you leave." The woman huffed and stormed off, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. Yvonne turned to Amara, who looked shaken. "Are you okay, baby?" Amara nodded slowly. "Why do people hate us, Mama?" Yvonne knelt down, her heart breaking at the question. "Not everyone hates us, sweetie. Some people just don't understand how to love. But that's their problem, not ours." As the days turned into weeks, the tension reached a boiling point. Mrs. Grayson had retreated further into her home, the neighborhood divided between those who defended her and those who sided with Yvonne and Amara. Then one evening, Yvonne received an unexpected visitor. It was Mrs. Grayson, standing on her porch with a look of desperation. "I need to talk to you," Mrs. Grayson said, her voice trembling. Yvonne hesitated but nodded, stepping aside to let her in. Mrs. Grayson sat at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly together. "I know you've heard things about me," she began, "and I know you don't trust me, but there's something you need to know." She took a deep breath before continuing. That letter. The one about the family I accused, it's true. I made a terrible mistake, and I've regretted it every day since. But I didn't do it out of hatred. I did it because I was scared, and I let my fear cloud my judgment. I've spent years trying to make amends, but it's never enough. Yvonne's jaw tightened. And what about Amara? Was calling the police on her your way of making amends? Mrs. Grayson shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No, I was wrong to do that. I was so consumed by my own grief and bitterness that I took it out on her. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Yvonne. I just want you to know the truth. Yvonne stared at Mrs. Grayson, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, pity, and confusion. The betrayal cut deep, but so did the vulnerability in Mrs. Grayson's voice. For the first time, Yvonne saw her not as a villain, but as a deeply flawed, broken person. And while that didn't erase the pain she had caused, it made Yvonne question her own response. As Mrs. Grayson left that night, Yvonne stood at the window, watching her disappear into the shadows. The lines between right and wrong had blurred, leaving Yvonne with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. The battle wasn't over, and the choices she made next would determine whether the neighborhood could find peace or remain fractured forever. The days that followed Mrs. Grayson's visit were steeped in an uneasy silence. Yvonne wrestled with the information Mrs. Grayson had shared, her emotions like tangled threads she couldn't unravel. The betrayal was still raw, yet Mrs. Grayson's confession had planted a seed of doubt. Could people truly change, or was this just another layer of manipulation? Amara, however, remained blissfully unaware of the deeper turmoil. To her, the lemonade stand was her sanctuary, a place where she could feel proud and confident. Yet even her youthful innocence couldn't shield her from the storm brewing in the neighborhood. The next confrontation came unexpectedly, during one of the busiest afternoons the stand had ever seen. A local news crew had arrived, drawn by the viral story of a young girl overcoming adversity with grace and determination. Cameras rolled as Yvonne spoke about Amara's journey, emphasizing the resilience and unity of their community. But not everyone was pleased with the attention. As the reporters packed up their gear, a group of Mrs. Grayson's supporters gathered at the edge of the lawn, their faces tight with disapproval. One of them, a stern-looking man in his 60s, stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chatter. "This isn't a charity case," he barked. "You're exploiting this for sympathy, turning neighbors against each other. You're no better than the people you claim to fight against." The crowd fell silent, all eyes on Yvonne. She took a deep breath, her voice calm but firm. "This isn't about exploiting anything. It's about teaching my daughter to stand tall in the face of adversity. If that makes some people uncomfortable, maybe they should ask themselves why." The man's face darkened, but before he could respond, another voice rang out, a younger man, standing near the back. "She's right," he said. "We've let fear and prejudice tear us apart for too long. It's time we start listening to each other instead of picking sides." The man's words seemed to shift the energy in the crowd, but the division was still palpable. Mrs. Grayson watched from her window, her hands trembling as she clutched the curtains. She had spent her life building walls, both physical and emotional, and now they were crumbling around her. Later that evening, as Yvonne cleaned up the stand, she found an envelope tucked beneath one of the lemonade pitchers. Inside was a handwritten note. "You think you're helping, but all you're doing is stirring up trouble. Stop before it's too late." There was no signature, but Yvonne's mind immediately went to Mrs. Grayson. Was this her way of retaliating, or had someone else taken it upon themselves to escalate the situation? Either way, it was clear that the neighborhood's simmering tensions were about to boil over. The breaking point came on a humid Saturday afternoon. Amara was busy serving lemonade when a loud crash echoed from across the street. Everyone turned to see a group of teenagers throwing rocks at Mrs. Grayson's house, shouting obscenities. "Hey!" Yvonne yelled, running toward them. "Stop it!" The teens scattered, their laughter ringing in the air as they disappeared down the street. Mrs. Grayson stepped onto her porch, her face pale and drawn. Are you okay? Yvonne asked, her anger fading into concern. Mrs. Grayson nodded, but her hands shook as she clutched the railing. "This is what happens when you turn people against me," she said, her voice cracking. Yvonne opened her mouth to argue, but the words caught in her throat. She realized that, despite their differences, they were both victims of the same toxic environment. And while Mrs. Grayson had undoubtedly sown the seeds of her own downfall, Yvonne couldn't ignore the humanity in her eyes. That night, as Yvonne sat on her porch, a plan began to form in her mind. She didn't want to fight fire with fire. If they were ever going to heal, they needed to find a way to bridge the divide. The next morning, Yvonne knocked on Mrs. Grayson's door. The older woman answered reluctantly, her expression wary. "I want to propose something," Yvonne said. "A neighborhood meeting. No accusations, no arguments. Just a chance for everyone to speak their truth and find a way forward." Mrs. Grayson hesitated, her eyes searching Yvonne's face for any sign of deceit. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, but I'm not promising anything." The meeting was set for the following Saturday, and the days leading up to it were filled with both hope and dread. Yvonne and Amara worked tirelessly to prepare, turning their front yard into a makeshift gathering space. They set up chairs, hung string lights, and even baked cookies to share. When the day arrived, the turnout was larger than Yvonne had expected. Nearly every household in the neighborhood was represented, their faces a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and guarded hope. Yvonne stood at the front, her heart pounding as she addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for coming. I know things have been tense lately, and I think it's time we face those tensions head-on. This isn't about pointing fingers or placing blame. It's about finding a way to move forward together." The first to speak was an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for over 50 years. She shared stories of how the community used to come together for block parties and holiday celebrations, her voice tinged with nostalgia. Others followed, their voices weaving a tapestry of shared experiences and unspoken grievances. Some spoke of the fear they felt as the world around them changed, while others shared the pain of feeling unwelcome in their own homes. When it was Mrs. Grayson's turn, the crowd fell silent. She stood slowly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I've made mistakes," she began, her voice trembling. "Big ones. And I know I've hurt people. People who didn't deserve it. I can't change the past, but I want to be better. I want to make things right." Her words hung in the air, met with a mixture of skepticism and tentative applause. As the meeting continued, something remarkable began to happen. Walls that had stood for years started to crumble, replaced by a fragile but genuine sense of understanding. By the time the sun set, the neighborhood felt different, lighter, somehow. Yvonne watched as people lingered, talking and laughing in a way they hadn't in years. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Later that night, as Yvonne tucked Amara into bed, her daughter looked up at her with wide, hopeful eyes. "Do you think everything will be okay now, Mama?" Yvonne smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Amara's face. "I think it's going to take time, baby, but I believe we're on the right path." Outside, the string lights cast a warm glow over the yard, a symbol of the hope that had been reignited in the heart of the community. The fragile peace that had emerged from the neighborhood meeting didn't last long. Beneath the surface of the tentative smiles and polite conversations, old resentments lingered, and new suspicions began to brew. It started small, with whispers and sideways glances. Someone claimed to have overheard Mrs. Grayson talking with one of the neighborhood men, Mr. Phelps, about restoring things to the way they were. The statement spread like wildfire, sowing seeds of mistrust. Yvonne noticed the shift almost immediately. The warmth from the meeting had dissipated. When she waved at neighbors on her way to work, some of them avoided her gaze. Others offered tight smiles that didn't reach their eyes. She tried to brush it off, but things escalated quickly. One morning, Amara came running into the house, her cheeks flushed with anger. "Someone knocked over the lemonade stand, Mama," she cried, dragging Yvonne outside. Sure enough, The little wooden stand was tipped on its side, the pitcher smashed, and the sign torn in half. Yvonne's heart sank as she crouched beside her daughter, trying to console her. "We'll fix his sweetheart," she said, her voice steady despite the anger bubbling inside her. "Don't you worry." But Yvonne could. That night, Yvonne sat on her porch, her mind racing. Who could have done this? Was it one of Mrs. Grayson's old allies, resentful of the newfound unity? Or could it have been someone else entirely, someone she hadn't yet considered? The answer came the following day, in the form of a neighborhood flyer slipped under her door. The flyer was anonymous, but its message was clear. This neighborhood doesn't need outsiders stirring up trouble. Leave while you still can. Yvonne stared at the words, her hands trembling. This wasn't just about the lemonade stand anymore. This was a direct threat, and it shook her to her core. But instead of retreating, Yvonne decided to fight back. She gathered Mara and a few of their closest allies. The young couple next door, the elderly woman who had spoken so fondly at the meeting, and even the young man who had defended them during the confrontation with the stern neighbor. Together, they rebuilt the lemonade stand, stronger and sturdier than before. As they worked, Mrs. Grayson watched from her window. Her face was an unreadable mask, but something in her posture suggested a mix of guilt and regret. She had been trying to mend fences since the meeting, but the damage she had caused over the years wasn't so easily undone. The tension reached its breaking point on a stormy Thursday evening. Yvonne was putting the finishing touches on dinner when she heard a commotion outside. She rushed to the window and saw a crowd gathering on Mrs. Grayson's lawn. At the center of the chaos stood Mrs. Grayson herself, clutching a piece of paper and shouting at the top of her lungs. Yvonne couldn't make out the words, but the anger and desperation in the older woman's voice were unmistakable. Yvonne hurried outside, her heart pounding. As she approached the crowd, she caught snippets of the argument. "Think you can take everything from me." Always been the problem, not the solution. Yvonne pushed through the throng of neighbors until she stood face to face with Mrs. Grayson. The older woman's eyes were wild, her hair disheveled. She thrust the piece of paper into Yvonne's hands. "Read it," she spat. "Go ahead. See what your so-called allies have been saying about me." Yvonne unfolded the paper and felt her stomach drop. It was a copy of an email, sent anonymously, accusing Mrs. Grayson of orchestrating the destruction of the lemonade stand and plotting to drive Yvonne and Amara out of the neighborhood. "I didn't write this," Mrs. Grayson said, her voice cracking. "I swear I didn't." Yvonne believed her. The tone of the email was too venomous, too calculated. This wasn't Mrs. Grayson's style. But if she hadn't written it, who had? The answer came sooner than Yvonne expected. As the crowd dispersed, muttering among themselves, a figure lingered at the edge of the lawn. It was Mr. Phelps, the same man who had been whispering with Mrs. Grayson after the meeting. Yvonne's gaze locked with his, and for a moment, she saw something flicker in his eyes, something dark and vindictive. She didn't confront him then and there. Instead, she decided to gather evidence. Over the next few days, she kept a close eye on Mr. Phelps, enlisting the help of her allies to uncover the truth. What they discovered was shocking. Mr. Phelps had been playing both sides, stirring up conflict to serve his own agenda. He had written the anonymous email, tipped over the lemonade stand, and even circulated the flyers, all in an effort to pit the neighborhood against itself. Yvonne confronted him one evening as he returned from work. Her voice was calm but firm as she laid out the evidence. "You've been behind this all along," she said. "Why, Mr. Phelps? What do you gain from tearing us apart?" Mr. Phelps hesitated, his face a mask of guilt and defiance. Finally, he sighed. "You wouldn't understand," he muttered. "Change is messy. Sometimes you have to break things to fix them." "That's not change," Yvonne said. "That's destruction. And it stops now." The confrontation sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Mr. Phelps was ostracized, his actions condemned by even his closest friends. Mrs. Grayson, humbled by the ordeal, stepped forward to publicly apologize for her past behavior, vowing to do better. As for Yvonne and Amara, they became symbols of resilience and hope. The lemonade stand flourished, attracting visitors from all over the city who came to support their mission of unity and strength. And while the scars of the conflict would take time to heal, the neighborhood emerged stronger, bound together by the shared determination to move forward. Yvonne stood on her porch one evening, watching as Amara served lemonade to a group of smiling neighbors. She felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years, a peace hard-won, but all the more precious for it. In the end, the neighborhood wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and it was worth fighting for. The summer air was soft and golden as the days stretched long into evenings, and the lemonade stand buzzed with activity. Amara, her braided hair glistening in the sun, laughed and poured glasses of lemonade to neighbors who had come to support her small venture. There were families with strollers, teens with skateboards, even the elderly who shuffled forward with eager smiles. It was no longer just a lemonade stand. It had become a symbol, a testament to the resilience of the little family that had refused to be silenced, and a beacon of hope for a neighborhood trying to mend itself. Yvonne, standing behind the stand, marveled at how far they had come. But despite the outward smiles and the growing camaraderie, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. The betrayal from Mr. Phelps had been uncovered, yet she couldn't ignore the way Mrs. Grayson still lingered near the edges of these gatherings, watching but rarely participating. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the streets in hues of lavender and gold, Mrs. Grayson approached. She looked older, wearier than before, as though the weight of the past weeks had aged her. "Yvonne," she said softly, her voice tentative. Yvonne turned, startled to see her standing so close. "Mrs. Grayson," she said, her tone guarded but not unkind. The older woman hesitated, clutching her purse tightly. Finally, she said, "May I sit with you?" Yvonne gestured toward the porch steps, and the two women sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of laughter and chatter from the lemonade stand drifting in the background. "I owe you more than an apology," Mrs. Grayson began, her voice trembling. "What I did, why I allowed to happen, it was wrong. All of it." Yvonne didn't respond right away. She watched Mrs. Grayson carefully, sensing that there was more she wanted to say. Mrs. Grayson took a deep breath. "I've been carrying so much anger for so many years. When my husband passed, I thought I was protecting this neighborhood by keeping things the way they were. But I wasn't protecting anyone. I was just holding on to my own fears." Yvonne softened, her own walls beginning to crumble. "Fear makes us do things we don't always understand," she said gently. "But it's never too late to change." Mrs. Grayson looked at her, tears glistening in her eyes. Do you think the neighborhood can ever forgive me?" Yvonne smiled, her expression warm. "Forgiveness doesn't happen overnight. But taking the first step, like you're doing now, that's how it starts." The two women sat together as the sun disappeared completely, the air cooling around them. For the first time, Yvonne felt that they were truly seeing each other, not as adversaries, but as two women trying to find their way in a complicated world. The weeks that followed brought even more change. Mrs. Grayson began attending community gatherings, not as a leader, but as participant. She volunteered to help with the neighborhood's garden project and even contributed to the lemonade stand fund, quietly leaving a crisp $50 bill in the tip jar one afternoon. Word of the lemonade stand continued to spread beyond their little corner of the city. Local news stations picked up the story, celebrating Amara's determination and the community's effort to rebuild itself. Reporters came to film segments, capturing the joy and laughter that had replaced the hostility of weeks prior. One day, as Yvonne watched Amara serve lemonade to a group of eager customers, a familiar face appeared in the crowd. It was Mr. Phelps. He stood awkwardly at the edge of the stand, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. When Amara noticed him, she froze, her cheerful smile faltering. The laughter around them dimmed as everyone turned to see what would happen next. Yvonne stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Phelps," she said, her tone even. "What are you doing here?" He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. "I came to apologize," he he said finally. To you, to Amara, to everyone. The crowd murmured, but no one interrupted. Mr. Phelps took a deep breath. I let my own bitterness get in the way of what was right. I thought I was doing what was best for the neighborhood, but all I did was hurt people. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to say I'm sorry. Yvonne studied him for a long moment before nodding. Thank you for saying that, she said. But apologies are just words. It's what you do next that matters. Mr. Phelps nodded, his expression earnest. I'll prove it, he said. I promise. The tension eased, and the crowd returned to their conversations, though some cast wary glances in Mr. Phelps's direction. Yvonne didn't know if he could be trusted, but she believed in giving people the chance to change. Months passed, and the neighborhood continued to transform. The once divided community was now a mosaic of voices, working together to create something beautiful. One crisp autumn morning, as the leaves turned brilliant shades of red and gold, Amara stood in front of the lemonade stand with a broad smile. She held up a plaque, her eyes shining with pride. It read, Neighborhood Spirit Award, presented to Amara Johnson and her lemonade stand for uniting the community. The crowd erupted into cheers, and Yvonne felt a swell of pride as she hugged her daughter tightly. Mrs. Grayson stood near the front, clapping enthusiastically. Even Mr. Phelps was there, helping to hand out cups of lemonade. As Yvonne looked around at the smiling faces, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. The road had been long and difficult, but they had made it, together. And in that moment, she knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, this neighborhood, her neighborhood, would face them united. As the chill of autumn settled in and the air grew crisp, the neighborhood began to prepare for its annual fall festival. It was a tradition that had been on hiatus for years, a casualty of the fractured relationships and tension that had once defined a community. But this year, under Yvonne's encouragement and with the momentum of their newfound unity, plans for the festival were back in full swing. The entire neighborhood buzzed with activity. Houses were adorned with pumpkins and corn stalks, orange and gold banners stretched across porches, and children raced through the streets, chattering excitedly about the festival centerpiece, a talent show that would feature music, dancing, and storytelling. Amara, of course, wanted to participate, and Yvonne, ever her biggest supporter, encouraged her to tell the story of their lemonade stand. Are you sure people want to hear it again? Amara asked one evening, as they sat together folding origami paper decorations for the festival. Absolutely, Yvonne said, smoothing a crease in the paper. Your story is powerful, sweetheart. It shows everyone what courage and kindness can do. With Yvonne's reassurance, Amara decided to practice every evening leading up to the big day, standing in front of her stuffed animals and neighbors who stopped by to visit. Each time she rehearsed, her voice grew stronger, her confidence shining through. The night of the festival arrived, and the neighborhood park was transformed into a vibrant hub of activity. Strings of twinkling lights hung from trees, casting a warm glow over booths serving cider and baked goods. A stage had been set up at the park center, and the audience gathered in folding chairs and on picnic blankets, laughing and chatting as the show began. Yvonne stood near the back of the crowd, watching as act after act took the stage. A young boy played a piano piece, his tiny fingers flying over the keys. A group of teenagers performed a dance routine that earned cheers and applause. Even Mrs. Grayson surprised everyone by reading a heartfelt poem she had written about the importance of community. Finally, it was Amara's turn. She stepped onto the stage, her small frame dwarfed by the microphone. She hesitated for just a moment, scanning the sea of faces before her. Then her eyes found Yvonne, who smiled and gave her an encouraging nod. Amara took a deep breath and began. My name is Amara Johnson, she said, her voice clear and steady. And this is the story of how my lemonade stand changed my life, and maybe even this neighborhood. As she spoke, the crowd fell silent, hanging on her every word. She told them about the dream she had of running her stand, the way her mother had encouraged her, and the challenges they faced when someone tried to tear it down. She spoke about the fear and sadness she felt, and how the neighborhood had come together to rebuild it. Even when people try to divide us, Amara said, her voice trembling with emotion, we chose to stand together. And now, my lemonade stand isn't just about selling lemonade. It's about showing that we're stronger when we support each other. By the time she finished, the crowd erupted into applause. Yvonne wiped away tears as she joined the standing ovation, her heart swelling with pride. As the festival wound down and the last of the booths were packed up, Yvonne and Amara lingered in the park, basking in the glow of the evening. Neighbors approached them one by one, offering kind words and warm smiles. You've inspired all of us, one woman said, squeezing Yvonne's hand. Your daughter has a gift, added another. She's going to do great things. Even Mrs. Grayson made her way over, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Thank you for not giving up on this neighborhood, she said softly. And thank you for not giving up on me. Yvonne smiled. We're all learning, Mrs. Grayson, and we're all in this together. As they walked home that night, Yvonne held Amara's hand tightly. The path ahead felt lighter, their burdens shared, and their hearts full. Months later, when spring rolled around, Amara's lemonade stand was thriving like never before. She had expanded her menu to include cookies and iced tea, and Yvonne had helped her set up a website for donations that would go toward local community projects. They had already raised enough money to repaint the neighborhood park and plant a community garden. The stand had become a gathering place, a symbol of what the neighborhood could achieve when it worked together. On any given afternoon, you could find neighbors chatting, children playing, and Mrs. Grayson sitting on a bench nearby, knitting scarves for the winter season. Yvonne often marveled at how much had changed. The neighborhood wasn't perfect. There were still disagreements and challenges, but the walls that had once divided them were gone. And as Amara handed a cup of lemonade to a customer, her face lit with a bright smile, Yvonne knew that they had built something far more enduring than a lemonade stand. They had built a community, and that was the sweetest victory of all. As the year pressed on, the neighborhood buzzed with the energy of spring renewal. Amara's lemonade stand was no longer just a place to quench thirst. It had grown into a hub for the neighborhood's revival. People came not only for lemonade, but for connection, laughter, and healing. Yvonne couldn't have been prouder of what they'd built together, but something about the calm seemed temporary, as though the shadows of past betrayals still lingered in unseen corners. One afternoon, as Amara served lemonade to a line of cheerful customers, Yvonne noticed a commotion down the street. A black sedan rolled slowly into the neighborhood. Its polished exterior gleamed in the sunlight, but the way it crawled forward, as if assessing every corner, unsettled her. The car stopped in front of Mrs. Grayson's house. The driver stepped out, a tall man in a crisp suit, holding a sleek briefcase. He knocked on her door, and she emerged moments later. Though they spoke too quietly for Yvonne to hear, Mrs. Grayson's body language told a story of tension and fear. Her shoulders stiffened, and her hand fluttered to her chest as though shielding herself from invisible harm. When the man handed her a folder from the briefcase, Mrs. Grayson's face paled. She glanced toward a lemonade stand, her gaze flicking between Yvonne and Amara as if deciding whether to approach them. Then, with a brief nod to the man, she retreated into her house and slammed the door. That evening, as the neighborhood settled into its usual quiet, Mrs. Grayson arrived at Yvonne's doorstep, clutching the same folder she had taken from the stranger. Her hands trembled, and her face was lined with worry. "I need to speak with you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Yvonne led her to the kitchen table, pouring her a glass of water. "What's going on?" Mrs. Grayson hesitated, staring at the folder as though it might bite her. Finally, she pushed it across the table toward Yvonne. "It's the redevelopment project. It's back." Yvonne frowned, opening the folder to find glossy brochures and legal documents detailing plans for a massive commercial complex that would take over their neighborhood. The same project that had been abandoned years ago, thanks to community opposition, was now being resurrected with new backing and more aggressive tactics. "They're targeting me," Mrs. Grayson admitted, her voice cracking. "They think if I agree to sell my house, The rest of the neighborhood will follow. And they're right. People trust me. They think I know what's best for the community." Yvonne's stomach turned. "But you're not going to sell, are you?" Mrs. Grayson's silence was answer enough. "They're offering me more money than I've ever seen," she said finally. "Enough to start over somewhere new, to leave all this behind." Her eyes met Yvonne's, brimming with guilt. "But if I do it, everything we've built will be gone." Yvonne leaned back in her chair, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She could see the conflict in Mrs. Grayson's eyes, the pull between self-preservation and the moral responsibility to protect their community. "What should I do?" Mrs. Grayson whispered. Yvonne didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached across the table, placing her hand over Mrs. Grayson's. "You already know the answer," she said softly. The next morning, Yvonne called an emergency neighborhood meeting at the park. Word spread quickly, and by midday, a crowd had gathered. Mrs. Grayson stood at Yvonne's side, clutching the folder of redevelopment plans. "We have a problem," Yvonne announced, addressing the crowd, "and it's going to take all of us to fix it." As she explained the situation, murmurs of anger and fear rippled through the crowd. Some people panicked, worrying about losing their homes. Others grew defiant, vowing to fight back. Mrs. Grayson stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've made mistakes in the past," she said. "I've let fear and greed cloud my judgment. But not this time. This time, I'm choosing to stand with all of you." Her words ignited a spark in the crowd, and they began to strategize. They would organize protests, contact local officials, and spread the word about the redevelopment project's impact on their neighborhood. Amara, ever resourceful, suggested they use the lemonade stand as a rallying point, creating signs and flyers to distribute to customers. The fight was on. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood became a hive of activity. Yvonne and Amara worked tirelessly alongside their neighbors, drafting petitions and attending city council meetings. News stations picked up the story, framing it as a David and Goliath battle between a small community and a powerful corporation. The redevelopment company fought back, sending lawyers to intimidate residents and offering increasingly lucrative deals to homeowners. But the neighborhood held firm, bolstered by the unity they had worked so hard to build. The turning point came during a public hearing at City Hall. Yvonne stood before a packed room, delivering a passionate speech about the importance of preserving their community. She spoke about the history of their neighborhood, the bonds they had forged, and the resilience they had shown in the face of adversity. When she finished, Amara stepped forward, holding a jar of lemonade. She placed it on the table in front of the council members. "This isn't just lemonade," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It's hope. It's love. It's what makes our neighborhood special. Please don't take that away." The room erupted into applause, and even the council members looked moved. In the end, the redevelopment project was shelved once again, thanks to the neighborhood's unwavering determination. The victory was bittersweet. Some battles had been lost along the way, and scars remained from the tension and fear they had faced. But the community had proven its strength, and the bonds they had forged were unbreakable. As the neighborhood gathered to celebrate, Yvonne watched Amara serve lemonade with a radiant smile. Mrs. Grayson stood nearby, laughing with neighbors as they shared stories of their triumph. Yvonne reflected on how far they had come. The lemonade stand had started as a simple dream, but had grown into something much greater, a symbol of resilience, unity, and the power of standing together. In that moment, Yvonne realized that the true victory wasn't just saving their neighborhood. It was transforming it into a place where everyone could belong, no matter their differences. And as Amara handed her a glass of lemonade, Yvonne raised it high, toasting to the strength of community and the sweetness of hope. As the sun set on the celebration, casting a golden glow over the park, the last remnants of tension in the air seemed to dissolve. The streets were filled with laughter and music, a symphony of relief and joy. Yvonne looked around at the faces of her neighbors, each one more than just a familiar face, but a testament to the collective effort that had brought them this far. Amara, her eyes sparkling with pride, handed out the last of the lemonade from her stand, chatting with the children who ran up, eager for a taste of the victory that had become as sweet as the drink itself. Mrs. Grayson was with her, a rare smile playing on her lips as she shared a joke with a few of the long-time residents who had once viewed her with skepticism. Now, she was a part of the community in a way that felt both natural and hard-earned. Yvonne watched her daughter, her heart swelling with love and admiration. Amara had become the heart of the neighborhood. The little girl who had once been afraid of standing alone now stood at the center of something much bigger. What had started as a single lemonade stand had evolved into the very foundation of their unity, a simple symbol of what it meant to come together and fight for something that mattered. But even in this moment of joy, Yvonne knew that the battle wasn't truly over. It had merely shifted from a fight for their homes to a fight for what they had learned to value: each other, the bonds they shared, and the understanding that no matter the size of the challenge, they could face it together. As the evening drew to a close and the park began to empty, Yvonne found herself standing alone at the lemonade stand, staring out at the empty chairs where moments ago laughter had filled the air. The warmth of the day still lingered in the cool evening breeze, and she thought back to the days before everything had changed. The days when she thought she was alone in her struggle, when she wasn't sure where her courage would come from. And then, just as the thought began to settle in her mind, Amara appeared beside her. The girl's small hand slipped into Yvonne's, grounding her in the present. "We did it," Amara said, her voice soft but resolute. "We saved our neighborhood." Yvonne smiled down at her, her heart full. "Yes, we did. And we've learned something, haven't we?" Amara nodded. "That we're stronger when we're together." Yvonne gazed across the park, her mind flooded with the memories of the past months, of the fear, the anger, the sacrifices, but also of the triumphs, of the community they had rebuilt, of the relationships that had been mended, and the walls that had crumbled. In that quiet, reflective moment, Yvonne realized that their victory was not just in keeping the redevelopment project at bay, but in the shift that had happened within the people of the neighborhood. They had learned to value each other, to put aside their differences, to come together for a common cause. They had been tested, yes, but in the end, they had found something far more important than any material possession. They had found each other. "What happens now?" Amara asked, her voice laced with wonder. Yvonne gave her daughter a thoughtful look, her eyes glistening with pride. "Now we live, and we continue to build what we've started, one step at a time, one day at a time." Amara squeezed her hand, looking up at her with a newfound sense of determination. "I think we'll be okay." Yvonne nodded, knowing that they would be. The future was no longer a distant, uncertain place. It was a road they would walk together, step by step. And with the foundation of love, unity, and resilience that had been laid, there was nothing they couldn't face. As they turned to walk home, Yvonne glanced over her shoulder at the lemonade stand one last time. The gentle hum of the evening breeze swirled around them, and she felt a deep sense of peace settle in her heart. Whatever the future held, they would face it side by side, a community that had learned the most important lesson of all. Strength is not in numbers alone, but in the willingness to stand together, no matter what. And as the stars began to the night sky above, Yvonne's heart was light, her spirit renewed by the thought that the best was yet to come. As Yvonne and Amara walked home, their footsteps fell in sync, a quiet echo against the fading hum of the neighborhood. The streets, which had once felt fragmented and uncertain, now seemed bound by an invisible thread, woven together by the courage of those who had chosen to stand up for what mattered. Every house they passed, every corner they turned, was a reminder of the struggle, the sacrifice, and ultimately, the victory they had shared. When they reached their small house, nestled at the far end of the street, Yvonne paused, taking a deep breath. The evening had cooled, but the warmth inside her chest, the kind that only comes from a hard-earned victory, lingered. Amara, as always, was quick to find joy in the smallest of things. "Mom, can we have a celebration tomorrow? Like a big neighborhood barbecue? We could invite everyone back and make it even bigger than today." Yvonne smiled, brushing a loose strand of hair from Amara's face. "That sounds like a wonderful idea. a celebration for all of us. Her gaze shifted to the window, where the last rays of the sun were dipping below the horizon. The sky, painted with hues of purple and pink, seemed to carry with it the promise of a new beginning. But even as her heart swelled with pride, a part of her knew that the world didn't stop turning just because they'd won a battle. There was always more work to do, always more people to fight for, and always the possibility that another challenge would rise up in the distance. However, tonight was for celebration. Tonight, the community had proven that unity was its greatest strength, and that even in the face of overwhelming odds, they could overcome anything. The days that followed were filled with the kind of activity that only comes after a long-awaited victory. Plans for the neighborhood barbecue quickly took shape, with everyone volunteering to bring something: grills to cook, blankets to sit on, and, of course, lemonade. The sense of camaraderie was palpable, the bonds between neighbors now forged in the fire of shared struggle. Yvonne found herself taking a step back, watching as the community took charge. The men and women who had once been strangers now worked together like old friends. Children ran down the streets, laughing and playing, their voices blending with the gentle rustling of the trees above. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood found its rhythm again. People spoke, with renewed hope in their voices. The same houses that had once felt like islands, separated by misunderstandings and isolation, now felt like homes, places of warmth, connection, and shared purpose. But while the outward transformation was clear, there was a quieter, deeper shift taking place within Yvonne herself. The woman who had once doubted her ability to lead, to protect her family, and to bring change to her community, now stood tall with a sense of certainty. She had found something in this fight that she hadn't known she was looking for. She had found herself. She'd learned that leadership wasn't about having all the answers. It was about listening, about guiding others through uncertainty, and trusting that they, too, could rise to meet the challenges before them. She had learned that love wasn't just a feeling. It was an action, a choice to show up for others, even when the road ahead seemed too steep to climb. And most importantly, she had learned that sometimes the greatest victories don't come from winning battles, but from the quiet transformation of hearts. As the neighborhood barbecue drew near, Yvonne sat down on her front porch, looking out over the street. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in soft oranges and pinks. Amara was inside, tinkering with one of her many craft projects, and for a moment, Yvonne allowed herself to just be. No plans, no worries, just a simple moment of peace. She thought about how far they had come, how the lemonade stand had sparked a movement, how the anger and fear had transformed into strength and solidarity. The journey had been long and hard, but it had been worth every moment. The sound of footsteps interrupted her reverie. Looking up, she saw Mrs. Grayson approaching, a plate of freshly baked cookies in her hand. The woman's face, once weary with the weight of difficult choices, was now calm, her eyes bright with gratitude. "I thought you might like these," Mrs. Grayson said, handing her the plate. "And I wanted to say thank you for everything, for believing in us when I wasn't sure we deserved it." Yvonne smiled warmly, accepting the plate. "We've all played a part. This victory isn't just mine, it's all of ours. Together, we did this." Mrs. Grayson's lips curled into a soft smile. "It feels like a new beginning, doesn't it?" Yvonne nodded. "It does. And I think this is only the start." The night of the barbecue was everything they had hoped for. The park, once a place of quiet solitude, was now alive with laughter and music. The smell of grilled food filled the air, mixing with the sweet scent of fresh lemonade. People from all walks of life, from different backgrounds and experiences, stood side by side, sharing stories and enjoying each other's company. Yvonne watched as Amara ran between groups of friends, her laughter ringing out like a song. For a moment, everything felt perfect, complete. The future seemed bright, full of possibilities. As the sun set and the first stars began to twinkle above, Yvonne stood beside Mrs. Grayson, looking out at the horizon. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Yvonne said softly. Mrs. Grayson nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. It really is. And it's all thanks to you, to all of us. Yvonne smiled, her heart full. We did this together. This is what it's all about. The people, the community, the love. As the music played on, and the people of the neighborhood danced under the stars, Yvonne felt a sense of peace settle deep within her. Whatever the future held, she knew one thing for certain. They had built something unshakable, something that could weather any storm. And as the night stretched on, Yvonne allowed herself to savor the moment. For in that fleeting, perfect instant, she knew that the fight wasn't just about preserving a neighborhood. It was about creating a place where people could truly belong, where love and unity were the foundations of every step forward. And for the first time in a long while, Yvonne was content, because she knew that the sweetest victories were never about the battles won, but about the people you fought for, and the strength that came from standing together, no matter what.